Hello everybody and welcome. My name's Alana Atlas and I'm privileged to be a board member of the Paul Ramsay Foundation. Can I also welcome my fellow director Rob McLean, who's here with us with his wife Paula. Can you first of all join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also pay my respects to all our First Nations friends and colleagues who are with us today. I hope everyone here is enjoying NAIDOC Week and getting into the spirit of get up, stand up and show up, which is a wonderful call for unity and reform. So it's my role today to welcome you all to our wonderful home, Yirranmar Place. Our aim is for this place to be a warm, generous home of creativity and purpose, focused on making our community and nation a better, fairer place. I hope you enjoy being here as much as we enjoy working here, and we certainly welcome you all. Now, for me, today is a bit of a fangirl moment. I first met Anne Summers about 35 years ago in New York, although she'll have absolutely no recollection of that at all. Now, at that time, she was the toast of the town as the owner and editor of Ms. Magazine, and I was a young and very green partner running a small Australian law firm in New York. Now, I was completely, at that time, in awe of the ambition, guts and sheer determination of what Anne was endeavouring to accomplish. I was in awe then and have been ever since of Anne's achievements and single-minded focus on improving women's lives. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity of a public forum to say that and to say thank you to you on behalf of me, the inspiration that you've been, and on behalf of all of us. So thank you, Anne. Now, the Paul Ramsay Foundation is honoured to sponsor a fellowship program where we support talented and recognised thought leaders to undertake disruptive research and pursue innovative ideas. We are delighted that Anne has agreed to be our first fellow. So I'll ask Cindy Penrose, our Chief Operating Officer and our Acting CEO, to introduce Anne and the research that she's completed. As you would expect from Anne, it is a call to action to stop one of the worst, if not the worst, scourges in our society, domestic violence. So once again, can I say welcome to you all, and over to you, Cindy.
Thank you, Alana. I too wish to acknowledge the Gadigal people upon whose lands Yirranmar Place stands, on which we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues also. Some of you may have seen the ABC's headline this morning, titled, "We Can No Longer Pretend We Didn't Know." The impossible choice facing mothers who experience violence. It sums up the importance of this work in one headline. Today's report builds on so much of the incredible work of many of you and of others regrettably not in the room today. Whilst this report is new, we know that this is not a new area for any of you. However, it's important for me to acknowledge that this is a new area for the Foundation, which we will be significantly embedding across our portfolios of work. We hope to join you on building upon your work and your impact, and we want to partner with you for it. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's launch of the groundbreaking report, The Choice, Violence or Poverty. Dr. Anne Summers, AO, known to you all, is a journalist, commentator, and the best-selling author of 9 books. Anne has advised Prime Ministers Bob Hawke and Paul Keating and ran the Office of the Status of Women. Anne has been an activist in the women's movement since its inception, and in 1974 was involved in establishing Elsie Women's Refuge, the first modern shelter for women and children escaping domestic violence. Anne was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for her services to journalism and to women in 1989, and was inducted into the Australian Media Hall of Fame in 2017. She's also held the first official Paul Ramsay Fellowship, and the release of today's report marks that end of that fellowship. So please join me in congratulating Anne and welcoming her to the stage.
Well, thank you, very much, Cindy, for that. And also thank you, Alana, for that very, very generous introduction. And I have to say, I don't remember us meeting in New York 35 years ago, but I'm probably relieved that the enterprise that you observed me being engaged in at that time, raising $20 million on Wall Street to buy Ms. and Sassy magazines, ended up failing. Had it succeeded, I'll probably be, a media mogul in New York, and I wouldn't be here today, and you wouldn't have this, the findings of the report that I want to report to you today. They're new, based on never before published data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and they are truly shocking. But before I do, I want to acknowledge and thank the people in the room that made this happen. I couldn't have done it without the fellowship granted to me by the Paul Ramsay Foundation. And there are so many people from Paul Ramsay that I need to thank that I can't possibly mention by name, but you all know how much I have enjoyed working with you and how much I've appreciated the fact that most of this work was done in New York, where I was living until fairly recently. So to be able to do this very important Australian work remotely from another country, it could only happen with people here being tremendously helpful. But I most sincerely want to thank Glenn Davis, no longer here, but now running the country, where it's perhaps more use to us. To Jenny Whalen, who's the one who made the foundation, made the fellowship happen, and also to Rob McLean, who introduced me to the Ramsay Foundation in the first place, I think 4 years ago. Nor could I have done it without UTS, which provided an academic home, even while I was in New York and living on Zoom, and all this was made possible by Deputy Vice-Chancellor Shirley Alexander, who ensured that I had a spot to perch on for the past 5 years while I sought financial support to undertake this work. And this is Shirley's second last day, I believe, in the job. Glad she was able to find the time to be here with us. The work itself relies totally on the data created, especially before this report by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and I am totally indebted and grateful to William Milne and his team, and who have come up from Melbourne to be here today, for the amazing support they provided. I'm not a statistician, which was a bit of a handicap when it came to writing a report based entirely on data, and I couldn't have done it without the constant support and practical assistance of Mary Ann O'Loughlin, Professor Bruce Chapman and Matt Taylor, both from the ANU Economics faculty, and who also undertook some original work of their own using the Hilda data, which complemented and reinforced my findings, which come from the ABS's personal safety survey. The report has been designed with great creative intelligence by Libby Blaney, and I can't thank her enough for the effort that she has put into it. I approached Libby last year and said, could she design a little logo for my report? That turned into a year's worth of intense work as the brief changed and I made new discoveries, and we became more ambitious in how we want to present the graphics and other data visualisations to make this report look so good. I was determined that despite the grim evidence that we were presenting, we did not want stereotyped images of women with black eyes holding trembling children. We wanted instead to convey the possibilities for a bright and positive future. You can see from the cover on the screen behind me that Libby has executed that with verve and a tremendous palette of colours. And of course, I want to thank all of you who are here today to learn about the findings on this work. I decided to do this work because it seemed to me we did not know enough about the extent or the consequences of domestic violence in this country, and that was hampering our efforts to reduce, let alone eradicate it. Domestic violence is, thankfully, now very much on the public agenda in Australia, and so it might sound strange for me to say that we don't know much about it. But despite the best efforts of people like Rosie Batty to make this a national issue, our report effort has not provided the evidence base that we need to get the changes that are necessary. I decided to try to see what I could find out that might help change this. The result is the report, The Choice, Violence or Poverty, which you can download from the QR codes on your table, or download from the website violenceorpoverty.com. It went live at 10 o'clock this morning, and I'm surprised it hasn't already crashed. So many people are trying to get hold of it because there's been so much anticipation built up on social media, which is very, very exciting. Now, it's a very detailed report with a huge amount of data, and I cannot possibly summarise it accurately in the time that we have. So after lunch, Jess Hill and I will be talking about the findings from a policy perspective. So I thought what might be most useful for me to do now is to simply list the findings that shocked me the most. That might be an overdramatic approach, but to be honest, I don't think I can exaggerate how bad things are, and we need to get that message out. We need to change the conversation, and to do that, we need the facts. We need the data, and quite frankly, we need to shock people into realising just how enormous a crisis we are facing in this country. So I'm giving you the 10 facts that shocked me the most. It's a listicle. Shocking fact number 1, the prevalence. We're told in newspaper articles and even some government reports that 1 in 6, or 17.3% of Australian women aged over 18 have experienced partner violence since the age of 15. Sounds terrible, 17.3%. But the trouble with that figure is that it includes all women in Australia over 18, including those who've never had a partner. And the ABS definition of partner violence is violence perpetrated by a cohabiting partner, i.e. someone you have lived with. So it's not really very useful to include in our prevalence figures women who, by definition, could not have experienced partner violence. It makes more sense if we look at women who have ever had a partner, and when we do that, the figure changes to 22%. I don't think most of us knew that. But there's another group who have suffered even more. I mean, 22% is a lot. It's almost a quarter of Australian women who've ever had a partner. But there's another group who have suffered even more, and that is women who were once partnered and who now live alone. There are around 800,000 of them, and a truly shocking 40% of them have experienced violence from a previous partner. But the really, really terrible figure, and the headline finding from my report, is the astounding 60% of single mothers in my study who had experienced partner violence. This is almost unbelievable. In fact, when I first got these figures, I thought they were wrong. I just simply couldn't believe it. Rang up Marianne, rang up Bruce, said, we've got something wrong here. But it's, in fact, as the ABS stats assure us, it's true. The shocking fact number 2, who are these single mothers? The second shock was the discovery that these women were married or in de facto relationships at the time the violence occurred. In other words, they were not single mothers then. They are single mothers now because of the violence. There are 185,700 of these women who are single now, 60% of our data set of 311,000 single mothers. And they're single mothers because they left the relationship, because of the violence. Shocking fact number 3, those who stay. We've just learnt that 185,700 women left relationships because of violence. But there is another group, those who stayed, and they number 275,000. Note which is the large number. It might sound blindingly obvious to say that women experiencing violence have 2 choices, to stay or to leave. But we've never had the numbers before. We did not know that 275,000 women currently live with a violent partner. And to put that number in perspective, it's approximately the combined population of Hobart and Launceston in 2016, which is when these figures were collected. Nor did we know just how many of those who stayed or who left but returned did so because they had no money or nowhere to go. Many, many thousands of women may have left for good if they had the money, but they feared trading violence for poverty and have chosen to stay in relationships where there is violence that could potentially escalate. Now that we know this, we can no longer ignore it. Shocking fact number 4, the physical violence. We have never before published numbers of what these women endured before they left. And we've got lists and lists and lists of actual types of behaviour and the numbers of women who experienced it, and it is truly heartbreaking to read it. I'll just give you a couple of them. 69,000 women experienced violence during pregnancy. 35,300 women experienced violence for the first time during pregnancy. 113,300 women had children in their care at the time of the violence, and 88,600 of them said that the children saw or heard the violence. Shocking fact number 5. The emotional abuse. One of the most disturbing tables in the report is the list that the ABC calls emotional abuse behaviours. We might these days call it coercive control. If we thought 60% of partner physical or sexual violence was high, we need to know that 70% of these now single mothers were subjected to emotional abuse, and 49% experienced both. I have never before seen such a comprehensive list, nor one that gives us the numbers of women who experienced the types of abuse listed. It would take me too long to read the whole list, but I highly recommend that you do. It contains all the types of controlling behaviour that we have come to understand is normal behaviour from such men, but the numbers are still staggering. For example, 150,300 women were subjected to constant insults to shame, belittle or humiliate them. It's 150,000. Then there's the 19,100 men who threatened to harm a pet, and the 12,500 who actually did harm the pet. No better way to get to the mother than to upset the kids by killing their dog or their pet rabbit. Shocking fact number 6, impacts of the abuse. Imagine living in a constant state of anxiety or fear for your personal safety. For 76,100 of our now single mothers, this was constant. Imagine trying to conduct your life, let alone hold down a job, if you constantly felt that way. Shocking fact number 7. I had no idea of the financial impacts on women who leave violent relationships. A full 50% of them end up living on government benefits, even when they are in employment. One of the most shocking findings, I'm overusing the word shocking, but I can't think of another word to fit the facts. One of the most shocking findings, and this is in a report full of shocks, is that a full 48.1% of these now single mothers are in the lowest quintile of gross weekly equivalised household income. That means their weekly income is $460 a week or less. Shocking fact number 8, the cash flow crisis. A full 60% of these now single mothers experienced household cash problems in the previous 12 months. Again, we need the numbers to emphasise just how dire the situation is. 78,400 could not pay their utility bills on time. 24,000 could not pay their rent or mortgage on time. 20,500 were unable to heat or cool their houses. 16,000 couldn't pay their credit card bills, their credit card minimum. And 17,400 went without meals. I actually read a story today on Twitter from listing a lot of the impacts on women of the poverty in which they're forced to live, where one woman used to say to her children, she'd give them their dinner and then she'd say, well, I'll have mine later after you go to bed. But of course she didn't. But to me, the most heartbreaking and revealing number is the 36,300 women who could not pay their car registration or insurance. We all know it's impossible, particularly if you're a single parent, to have employment if you don't have a car. If you can't drive to work, if you can't drive your kids to childcare, if you can't do all the normal things associated with most suburban lives, which in this country requires a car, you are excluded from society in ways that make it very hard for you to get back in. So this is a particularly poignant finding and one that we had not been able to quantify until now. This is how we treat women who have left violent relationships, but it gets worse. Shocking fact number 9, government payments declining value. I'm ashamed to say that I did not know that the system of government payments for single mothers is so cruel. I had no idea how bad it was. In fact, I probably never even thought about it until I did this report. It's a complicated system, too complicated to spell out in all details here, and you can read it in chapter 3 in the report. But I will just highlight 2 injustices that are especially egregious. First, thanks to John Howard in 2006, and later Julia Gillard in 2013, single mothers are now required to go onto the dole, that's otherwise known as job seeker, once their youngest child turns 8. In the eyes of the government, they are no longer single mothers, they are the unemployed. The difference in income is $210,600 is $210.20. Just as your kids are growing faster, needing more clothes, eating a lot and wanting cool sneakers, phones, etc., your income drops to way below the poverty line. Second, and just as scandalous, is that the parenting payment that single mothers get until their youngest child turns 8 is indexed differently from JobSeeker. This country punishes the unemployed in ways that are so barbaric that even employer groups are calling for change. The parenting payment is indexed to male weekly earnings, while JobSeeker is indexed to the much lower CPI. The result is that in 2006, when these changes were first introduced, the fortnightly difference between the two payments was $56. In 2021, as a result of the different form of indexing, that difference had grown to $186 a fortnight. So why do we punish single mothers who have escaped violence in this way? Not to mention unemployed people. Shocking fact number 10. Why didn't we know this, and what are we going to do about it? I feel embarrassed that I did not know these prevalence figures or the impact of leaving a violent relationship has had on so many women. I've supposedly been involved in these issues for decades, but I had never focused on these essential facts. But a bigger question is, why didn't the government know? These are, after all, government figures. Why weren't they used to inform the draft National Plan to End Violence Against Women 2022-2032, which was released by the former government late last year? How can we credibly devise a plan to end violence when we don't know its extent or its impact? We have a lot of self-reflection to do now that we do know these figures and these facts. We cannot unknow what we have learnt from this data. I look forward to being part of the process of helping ensure that all these women get the help they need and deserve, and that we use this knowledge to plan for prevention and ultimately eradication of domestic violence. Thank you.
The next part of today's event is the fireside chat with Dr. Anne Summers and Jess Hill. Welcome back, Anne, and Jess, ask you to come to the stage while I introduce Jess. Jess is known to many of you also, a journalist, author and speaker who focuses primarily on social issues and gendered violence. Jess started her career almost 15 years ago as a producer for ABC Radio, went on to become a Middle East correspondent for the Global Mail, and then an investigative journalist for Background Briefing. Jess' report has won 2 Walkley Awards, an Amnesty International Award and 3 Our Watch Awards. Her first book, See What You Made Me Do, on the phenomenon of domestic abuse and coercive control, was released in 2019 and was awarded the 2020 Stella Prize. In 2021, it was adapted into a series on SBS. Recent projects for Jess include a podcast series on coercive control and patriarchy called The Trap, and a quarterly essay on how #MeToo has changed Australia, titled The Reckoning. Since the book was released, Jess has spoken at almost 300 public events about coercive control and regularly conducts training and education for groups as diverse as magistrates, high school students, workplaces and local councils. Over to you, Jess.
Now, is this thing on? It is. Wonderful. I was told not to ask that, but I did. Before we begin, I'd like to also acknowledge the Eora people and the traditional custodians of this land, pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the room today, and happy NAIDOC week. This report, I just want to very briefly reflect on it because Anne has so generously brought me into the journey of this report, which my wonky soul is just absolutely thrilled about. And I think it is both intellectually exciting for the innovation at the core of this report, but absolutely game-changing in terms of social justice and the potential for us to achieve better social justice in Australia. And just to also, add to the thank yous to you, Anne, for your lifetime of work in this area of trying to give women and children the right to be independent, and that you have staged this critical intervention at a time when we've had probably the most heightened awareness of domestic abuse and family violence that we've ever had. And I don't know how you organised to have a Prime Minister who was the child of a single mother, but that was very deft of you. And I think that we're at a really unique point. There's no shortage of experience of violence, of intimate partner violence in this government. There's no shortage of understanding of this issue. We have a Minister for both women and finance, and for those of you who pay close attention to this area, you may remember that the last time that happened was Kelly O'Dwyer, and we got the Respect at Work report as a result, another nation-changing report. So the time is now, and you are grasping the nettle very vigorously, which I'm very, very excited to see. But I just wanted to start at the pointy end of things, which is that we are right on the precipice of having the next national plan that will see us through for the next decade, with its really central objective to reduce violence against women and their children. The last plan on that one objective framework failed. It's not to say that there was nothing good that came from it. There was. Now, I've been told that of the draft that's circulating confidentially of the national plan, there is not one mention of single mothers in that plan. So what sort of intervention do we need to have at this moment as we are getting very close to setting the framework for our response? What sort of intervention do you want Labor to make?
It's a huge question, and it's such an important one. Before I answer or try to answer it, I just make the comment about the timing of the release of this report. We at the Foundation spent a lot of time anguishing about when we should release it, and should it be before the election, try to influence the election? Should it be during the election, or should we wait till afterwards? And I think we made the right decision to wait till afterwards. I think if we'd dropped it during the election, it would have sunk without trace. Had we released it before the election, again, it probably wouldn't have got much attention. But waiting for after the election, and fortunately there being not just a change of government, but there's a palpable change in the country in the way which people, I think, of all political persuasions recognise and applaud, and that is we have now a government that's actually interested in governing, which we haven't had for a long time, is interested in doing things, has a strong commitment to social justice, and, as you say, an interest in issues around violence against women, and I think is already very receptive. I mean, I did a confidential private briefing 2 days ago in advance of the report's release to a number of ministerial staffers and departmental people from Treasury, from PM&C, from Finance, from Social Services, from all the relevant departments, and briefed them on the findings of this report. There's already tremendous interest in the findings, and I don't think they can be ignored. Now, how we are able to get these findings into policy, there's the recommendations of the report are that we do something urgently about getting these women off job seeker and back onto the parenting payment, and we do something about the level of the parenting payment because it isn't enough. So that's one set of demands, and that of course has dollars attached to it, so that's going to be challenging, but I think we have to make it happen. But I think the question of the national plan is such an important one because, I mean, the reasons for the failure of the previous national plan started off very well, started with good intentions. It actually had some objectives in the beginning, but they kind of got lost on the wayside. There were no measurement, no targets, no nothing. And as you and others have pointed out, no analysis since about what went wrong. So I mean, why in the hell would you create another? That was a 12-year plan. Why would you? And that was a plan to reduce violence. This new one is a plan to end violence. I mean, how are you going to end it when you couldn't reduce it? Is an interesting proposition. But I think that you cannot have a national plan that doesn't include what we now know from this report. And what we know from this report interestingly enough, is all government data. This is not something that we've dreamt up at a university somewhere, or we've done a survey of 10 women. This is ABS verified data from the government's own data collection, and it has to be reflected in the national plan. Now, I imagine that Katie Gallagher and her, Amanda Wishworth and her colleagues in this area will understand that once it's pointed out, as we will be making sure that they get that point of view. But I think that the draft national plan really is a load of rubbish, quite frankly. I mean, it's a great statement of principles and it says all the things that are wrong with domestic violence, and that's fine. But, we're way past that point. If a national plan to either reduce or end violence has actually got to, first of all, understand the extent of the problem, and it doesn't. I mean, the figures cited, I went and checked them again last night, the figures cited and sourced to the ABS PSS in the draft national plan are wrong. They are incorrectly cited, and the language is incorrect. They completely understate the extent of the problem, and they have no solutions. And this is why they have no targets, because they don't know what to do. And I think one of the reasons I was so interested in doing this report and so interested in focusing on a group, I mean, it didn't have to be single mothers, it could have been another group. I mean, this other group that I'm really interested in, this 800,000 lone women who have experienced violence and who now live alone. Who are they? Who are all these women? They tend to be older than the single mothers, so I suspect they are the single mothers of the past who have never been partnered, and who, because they're older than the single mothers. But who are these people, and what's their story, and how did it happen, and what can we learn from that story? So I think that, I wouldn't favour another round of consultations, because I think that the consultations that were done last time were, this is my personal view, and I know nobody agrees with me, but I thought were rubbish, and I did take part in them myself, and I thought they were rubbish. We don't need that. We need targeted consultation on specific areas and issues. And as I said, one of the reasons I targeted, I made my report about a special group and dug deep, and we learned so much from digging deep into the experiences of a particular group. And we need to do that with various other groups. And that's where we build our targets. We build our targets from finding out what's wrong and what needs to be fixed. And then you say, okay, well, this needs to be fixed. So these are 10 things are our targets. This is our timeline. And these are KPIs for the people in charge of the plan. And let's attach their salary to it. I mean, let's make it meaningful. Instead of all this, the targets are, the number of people read the report. That's a tick. That's a KPMG tick. Well, it's not. It's rubbish.
I think the national plan, as it stands, there are some, as you say, it's a good statement of principles. There is some areas that have been introduced as a statement of principle that really carry this work, and one of them is the focus on recovery, which has never been part of a national plan. I think also to say, just for those who maybe aren't so across this discussion, because it's very inside baseball, is that some people were worried if the national plan were to expire, that it would endanger funding, or that, we need the national plan to renew as soon as the old one expires. That's not the case. The funding arrangements, federal funding arrangements, are decoupled from the national plan. We're actually, as far as I know, we are the only or one of very few countries that even has a national plan. It's wonderful that we have a national plan, but that we can be a little bit religious about the national plan and about needing it at a certain time, when actually what we need is a national plan that has the right framework from which to head out.
And that can be effective.
And it can be effective, rather than rushing to have it as soon as possible. There's no problem, really, I can see, in there being a gap where perhaps we look at the PSS data, which is not perfect, but is the best data that we have, and include
There's a lot more of it, as I discovered, than we ever knew about.
Yeah, well, what don't we know about?
Exactly. Well,
what are the unknowns?
Exactly. Well, I think that's what we need to be interrogating further. And I'm very grateful to the the ABS for the help that they gave me, and I'm very grateful. Three of them are here today. I'm very, very pleased that they are here because they guided me towards data that I didn't know existed, that I wouldn't have known to ask for. And there has got to be a lot more data that's relevant to this plan, and not talking about single mothers, but talking about other groups that we need to be looking at. I mean, one of the things I have heard that Amanda Bishworth is not committed to rushing the plan, that she'd rather get it right than be on time, and it's already expired. We're supposed to start on the 1st of July. Well, it doesn't matter if it doesn't start for 6 months or even a year. Let's make it a good plan, and let's make it a modest plan, maybe, a smaller plan where we actually achieve results. But I mean, as we know, as I've shown from the figures I provided before, the prevalence is much, much higher than we thought. It's distributed differently from the ways in which we understood. And so the plan has got to reflect that. And we've also, as we know, new types of violence and abuse are occurring. Perpetrators are getting smarter, less likely to be physical, more likely to be, technologically abusive or use financial techniques and other forms of behaviour that are harder to track and harder to prove and that the police aren't really capable of dealing with. So, the whole picture is evolving and we can't base a plan on what things were like when we started Elsie, 48 years ago, I hate to say it. It's very different now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just going back to, the thing around recovery in the plan, I think one of the most memorable and sort of catchy interventions that have been launched this year was by Rosie Batty, saying recovery is prevention. And what you say in the report is that, these single mothers, they are like some of the most accessible people to not just them, but also to their children. And we're thinking about not just ensuring that there is some, that we help them recover, and not just recover but thrive, but also that we can go in for early interventions, that we can find out, well, in these single parent families, are there teenagers in that family who are already exhibiting violent traits towards their siblings or parents? Where can we start to intervene early so that this does not become a lifetime pattern? But the accessibility of these single parent families and the fact that actually implicit in the way that we respond to them is the likelihood of us preventing intergenerational violence.
I mean, instead our approach is punitive.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Parents Next, which we didn't discuss, but there's a whole section on Parents Next, which has a very much higher representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women than other programs. They are treated with abject cruelty and humiliation. It is just a disgusting program. I had actually thought that the Labor Party had committed to abolish it, but I find that's not true, that they need to be lobbied hard on that. But there is, I think, a willingness to consider getting rid of it, but it's not policy yet. But that has to go. That just has to go. It's terrible. But even, the single women on Parents Next, on the parenting payment, things are bad enough and things are tough enough. But once their youngest child turns 8 and they're put on the dole and expected to live on $661 a fortnight with growing children, I mean, on top of that, they have to undertake these 50 hours a fortnight of mutual obligations. So they have to go and look for work. Or if they can't look for work, they've got to go and do community volunteering work. And I mean, and they've got these little kids to raise. I mean, it's just absolutely horrendous that they should have to do that. And some of the idea of training or helping you get a job. There's one case that I cite in the report that I took actually from one. There have been several parliamentary inquiries into Parents Next, and they've all been absolutely savage with their condemnation of this program and why it needs to go. But one of the examples was of a woman, she goes to see her provider. Everyone has a provider that looks after them. She goes to see her provider to undergo or fulfil her mutual obligation to society for being so kind to her, to help her get a job. And so the provider takes her into a room and sits her at a desk and puts the television, turns on the computer to seek.com and say, okay, you sit there for an hour and then you can go home. And that's how they help people get jobs. I mean, it's just nuts.
And there's a financial incentive for the providers to put them into even a short, like 15 hours of work per week. They get a payment for doing that. And so it's not necessarily about providing work that is satisfying or is going to lead to anything,
No,
but
it's
literally
about
just a
rewarding.
stopgap.
Yes, well, a lot of people are making a lot of money out of this and they aren't the single mothers. So I mean, the whole system is crook and has to be redesigned. And I mean, the last thing I want is, to set up inquiries and royal commissions and all the rest of it and spend 5 years designing a whole new system, even though that's what we need, because we can't wait that long, and we do know what's wrong, and a lot of the things are easily fixable if you have a government which is amenable, and I hope that we currently do, and that it's going to be incumbent on us to ensure that they get that right message about what needs to happen. But I mean, I think the most urgent thing is to ensure that these women, these single mothers struggling to bring up kids, have more money. Now, there are other things we can do as well, but having money one of the things that we learnt during the COVID, when there was that COVID supplement of $550 a fortnight extra to everybody on welfare, that just transformed people's lives. All these stories about women, they could buy fresh food, they could buy a new coat, they could buy clothes for their kids, they could get the leaking tap fixed. I mean, they were able to act like normal people because they had enough money to live on. And as soon as the COVID relief program stopped and they lost that money, they're back to being treated horrendously the way they are now. But they had it. One of the benefits of that was not just to have more money and be able to eat better food and buy clothes for your kids and maybe even go to a movie or enjoy yourself or something. It changed their idea of themselves. If you're not struggling, to survive, just to get basic food and necessities of life, which we know from the figures I cited, 17,400 women went without meals, so their kids could eat. If you're not having to have those sorts of battles, your idea of yourself changes, your confidence changes, your ability to interact with the world improves, your chances of being able to get training or to get a job improve. It's actually better for the economy. And anybody with any brains in government would realise that.
Well, and not to mention the fact that, the flip side to what women and children experience in family violence is the opposite to that is dignity. And women, mothers are degraded in situations of family violence by the perpetrator. The children see them being degraded, and then they leave the perpetrator, often with the assistance of their children. Children are often very much involved in that process. And then the children see them being degraded again by the state. Yes. And, that at a developmental time, that message to the child is that the mother is a degraded object.
Yes.
And so think about, the things that were coming to my mind is it's like the likelihood that you'll have one child look at that and say, well, the only way for me to get any safety and security is for me to have power over others. Or another child to say, the only way that I'll ever be safe is I find someone who can exert the type of control that I need to exert power and keep me safe. And it's like this work on dignity is so central to recovery and to prevention. And it just seems like basically we have had, really since 1996, a process that has, through state intervention, mirrored the process that women and children experience in family violence.
Certainly. I think that analysis is absolutely spot on. And I think what we have to do, and we have to make that part of the package of demands, necessities, is as well as restoring women to the parenting payment and raising the level of the parenting payment and putting these women on a sort of financial footing whereby they can regain the dignity, regain their mental health, regain their confidence. So many women are traumatised, physically, emotionally, mentally. Some women never recover. 10 years later, they're still traumatised. that what we have to include in this upgrading of the treatment is not just the financials, which I think are essential and which we have to find the money for, one way or another, but also we need to have decent and empathetic and effective programs that address this whole risk of intergenerational transmission. Whereby, as you put it, the kid sees the only way to be powerful is to abuse another person, and the girl might see, well, the only way, this is how relationships are. You get,
It's the only way to be safe is to be under the,
And this is when you look at my report, the 275,000 women who are currently living in a violent relationship, and are not 90,000 of whom want to leave, but don't. And for some of them, it's interesting, some of them it's because they don't have any money, some of them it's sort of cultural reasons, some of them, they're ashamed and embarrassed, they don't want to have to tell anyone. But one of the things that's specifically mentioned, which is kind of ironic and horrible, is they're scared about what's going to happen to their pets.
Yeah.
And I mean, that might sound sort of like, why do the pets matter so much? But they do matter to families and to kids.
Enormously.
And one of the problems, of course, as the service providers in this room know only too well, that most refuges in shelters can't accept pets, and they often can't accept teenage boys. So, we've also got to deal with that side of things. The new cluster and hub, is that right? Model that is being already quite successfully introduced into Victoria and South Australia, and is now being unrolled a bit slowly, I think, in New South Wales. That enables families escaping violence to escape as a family. The teenage boy can come, the dog or the rabbit or the parrot or whatever it is can come, and so they can be together and have at least had that level of comfort. They can bring luggage, they can bring all the sorts of things that you can't bring to an already crowded and stressed shelter. And so all these things come together, and we've got to start seeing them as all part of the same thing. I mean, you can't just do a little bit here and a little bit there and forget that it's all part of an integrated system of abuse, of humiliation, and the recovery is going to be multifaceted as well. It's going to be financial, it's going to be emotional, it's going to be psychological, and most of all, it's got to break this cycle. And I think we can do that, or we have to find a way to do it. Rosie's right, we have to find a way to do it.
I think that, it's interesting to look at, interesting and just utterly depressing to look at the way that government policy has changed over the past 40 years. And you articulate this so well in the chapter on government policy and the history lesson that you give on, where things started under Whitlam, where single mothers were brought out of this position of ignominy, to be able to be given the chance to have independence for them and their children, starting obviously partly with the parenting payment that put them on the same pension as the widows, which is also conceptually very important, which says it's not your fault that you're a single parent. Just like someone whose other half was lost because they died, you're not at fault either, and we're going to compensate you adequately or to the same level.
And so that's completely changed.
Totally
changed.
It's
your fault. It's your fault.
You must have done something.
You must have done something to be a single mother.
Yeah.
And we gave you 8 years, and now the youngest kid's 8. You're no longer a single mother. You're an unemployed person, an unspeakable unemployed person on the dole.
And also but this is not an accident, and this is not just that things unravel unless you pay attention to them. This is a 40-year concerted campaign from anti-feminist men's groups to undo the policies of Whitlam and Hawke. And
they have succeeded to a very large extent, and that's got to stop.
And it's, I think, also what we saw with the Labor government, with Gillard backing the suggestion from Shorten to make things worse for single mothers when that passed the Senate the same day as the misogyny speech. That there has been, not only have anti-feminist men's groups been successful in their lobbying of the Howard government, and the Howard government does not get nearly enough put on the hook for what it did in 2006 around child support, family law and welfare to work. But it has introduced, like a parasite, the way of thinking about single mothers, or reintroduced that way of thinking, such that Labor has been victim to it as well.
And I mean, I do hope that there is a change of thinking in Labor. I think there is certainly with some of the members. If we can use my report as an opportunity to sort of help challenge those entrenched views and this blaming of single mothers, I think one of the things that's sort of opened a lot of people's eyes that I've been able to talk to already about this is that the coupling of violence and single mothers has changed things.
Absolutely.
Because people hate single mothers because they're welfare cheats or they're sluts. They just have babies so they can get more money and all that stuff, which is complete rubbish, as we know. But that's still an ongoing stereotype. But we are sympathetic to women who experience violence. So when you suddenly put the two together, it does shock people into thinking a bit differently. And I think we have to really try to leverage that as much as possible to get people to understand that these women that you think are despicable are actually the heroes. They are the ones who, knowing they risk going into poverty. I mean, the 275,000 women who stay, a very large number of them stay because they'll rather put up with the violence than go and live in poverty. I mean, and it's called the choice. It's the hideous choice that so many women, that thousands of women in Australia are forced to make all the time. And society says, why doesn't she leave? And if she doesn't leave, there's ANRO's report, Social Attitudes reporting, that shows that 32% of Australians think that women who stay with violent partners are partly to blame for what happens. So, you're screwed either way.
Totally. I think so much, and I really encourage everyone here to read this report like line by line and just like really soak up what these data points are showing us, because it's more than even just a sum of its parts. This is like the opportunities to expand on all these points is enormous. There's so much in here that stuns me. Or not as stunning, because I hear this from people. You get correspondence from victim survivors all the time, but you don't know if you're hearing from a certain cohort. So it's hard. It's very illuminating to see it as a sort of nationwide cross section. Some of the stats, like before separation, mothers who experienced personal violence, partner violence, had about the same income as mothers who did not. But it's about the degradation of that income after separation and the fact that they don't, on average, regain that. Also, the fact that of the single mothers who had left violence, that there was a disproportionately high number of them who had completed post-school qualifications. They're actually quite an educated cohort.
They are a more educated group, the single mothers in this survey, than the general population.
So there's some really interesting, and I think the thing that this report turns on its head, and God, you know that Mark Latham is going to try to make hay with this, and it's just going to be so annoying. He's just going to completely misconstrue it, and you're going to spend a lot of time on that.
No, I'm not.
Or not you.
Got better things to do.
But the whole idea that violence causes poverty, which is an idea that is apparently supported by data, particularly on police reporting, because in lower socioeconomic areas you've got higher degrees of police reporting, which we know is linked to so many other things. What this report flips on its head is that poverty does not cause domestic violence, but domestic violence can cause poverty.
Yes. That is the key learning from the report. That is the key thing that I want people to understand and take away. And it's incredibly hard to get through to people. And, Mark Latham, of course, doesn't help with his rubbish. And that point is true, but his figures are based on the local area government police call-outs. And as we know, police call-outs are much more common in some areas than they are in others. Now, if I live in Vaucluse or Rose Bay or some fancy suburb, and I'm experiencing violence from my husband, who's a judge, I'm not going to be calling the police. I'm going to be calling my girlfriend.
Neither are your neighbours.
No, of course not. Of course not. Don't see police cars in Vaucluse. No, I'm going to be dealing with it privately. I might leave. I might go to my girlfriend's place. I might go to my mother's place. I might, I'll find a friend I can go to. but I'm not going to go to a shelter. I'm going to be too embarrassed to let anyone know about this. And this is one of the things that I would really love that wish the ABS had, but apparently they don't keep them, and that is to have this data correlated to postcodes, and so we could actually measure the violence, but apparently that isn't possible. But if we could find ways to measure the violence against where people actually live at the time of the violence, I think that would be one powerful way of challenging that myth, that it's only poor people who experience violence and that violence is a cause of poverty. I mean, it is true that if you are poor and you are vulnerable, you may well be more susceptible to violence for all sorts of reasons, but that's not necessarily the cause. That's not how you started. That's how you ended up.
That's right, yeah. And I guess not to strike a false equivalence between rich and poor areas, or there's certainly areas of Australia in which family violence is endemic, in ways that it's not in Rose Bay, partly because of some financial independence and security for women as well in a different way. But I think the other side of domestic violence causes poverty, and this is really present in one of the data points in the report, is I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was like 75% of 90,000 women who left the home left property and assets behind. That money is going somewhere. The impoverishment of women is also in many of these cases the enrichment of an abusive man. And there are men who are profiting financially as a result of their violence.
And we need to know a lot more about that. And that is something that, talking with Anna Bligh before about the work that they're doing on financial abuse and some of the details that none of us really know or understand. But that needs to be documented. I mean, there are a few sort of little case studies that I quote from women who they leave, they've got nothing. The former partner's now got 2 houses and 3 cars and a new business, and she's living on the pension. There is a lot of that, and it could be documented, and I think it needs to be. Then there's the whole area of child support, which I don't go into in great detail, but the number of $4 billion outstanding in child support payments, and women who apply, they're deemed to have received the money, so they get their family tax benefit cut.
Well, that's
even though they didn't get the money.
That's the slippery statement you include from Services Australia. On their website, it says, generally, the more child support you get, or you're entitled to get, the less family tax benefit Part A we give you.
Yes.
So it doesn't even matter if you get it.
No, they don't care.
It's quite astonishing. We're going to wrap up in a minute. I just want to, one last thing. There's so many things I'd like to ask you, but I think it's really important to mention we have spoken quite broadly about single mothers. We haven't drilled down into cultural backgrounds. That is a bit of a failing of the PSS in terms of it not really giving a lot of indication of who of these single mothers have Indigenous backgrounds, what level of disability, etc. And I just wonder, you've brought in other studies to try to supplement where there are those gaps. If the government is looking at using this as a database, we're going to have to bring in a number of different data points, aren't we? Because the PSS, while robust, does not tell us much.
It doesn't include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and that is regrettable, and that is something. One of the recommendations of my report is that we ask the government to ask the ABS to do a feasibility study on creating a longitudinal study on violence, because the cross-sectional stuff we have is great. We know what happens at a certain point, but we can't trace the women the way that Bruce Chapman has done with Hilda, and that's where we got the information about the loss of income over time after leaving a relationship. We need to be able to do that with violence and other social issues, and that has to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. They already, I think, the next PSS, I believe, it does include LGBT. That was the next question. The report, the current report, does include CAL status, and it does include disability. And one of the most shocking findings, I didn't mention it before, but one of the most shocking findings is that something like 65% of the women in the survey suffered from a disability, and that's compared with 18% of the population at large. Now, because it's a cross-sectional, we don't know whether the disability was acquired as a result of the violence, but to me it's very logical, and when you look at the forms of violence which are listed,
And head injuries.
head injuries and so on, acquired brain injury, when you look at all that, it is very likely that much of the disability has been caused by the violence. And then, of course, disability then becomes a trigger for additional violence. So, I mean, that's another area that needs urgent investigation, in my opinion, but the disability rate amongst these single mothers is horrendous.
Well, thank you, Anne, so much.
That cheery note.
But, you know, I think the cheery note has been struck in the way that you have written this report, the personal sort of power that you're putting behind it, and the fact that you will just have single mothers across the country cheering this and their children. And I, you know, just on behalf of, as you know, them and all of us, thank you for all the work that you have done and for bringing this innovation into this area at such a critical point.
Thank you for all of you who helped me.